So I wanted to end this series on William Bartley and his book, The Retreat to Commitment, with a look at some of the philosophers that were around him at the time or have come since and offered criticism. Because, as I've mentioned a few times, Bartley died tragically quite young, and of course his theory was still in its infancy, or at least a relative infancy. So I thought it would be important to at least offer a few different views, and indifferent being the important word there, because I collected a few people, four precisely, that thought very different things about Bartley's philosophy. And I don't want to get too deep into these things, simply because it's been quite a long series already. And I think perhaps best, I'm simply going to offer what these people thought in a very shortened format. And if people want to go and find the papers themselves and read them, they're all online. They're all online papers, except for David Miller's criticism, which comes from his book, A Defense of Critical Rationalism. Or again, I think I'm saying that wrong, A Critical Rationalism, A Defense. But perhaps that is even online these days in some sort of illicit PDF format. Now, the first person I want to talk about is Dimitri Sepetai. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, but we did a podcast together maybe a couple of years ago now, and I must have pronounced his name wrong throughout the whole podcast, despite him telling me exactly how to say it. But he wrote a very recent analysis of the debate and the criticism between Bartley and Popper and the back and forth, and wonderfully he managed to get his hands on some archival material. And we got an insight into just what Popper did think about Bartley in his private correspondences, because, as we've mentioned a few times, Popper didn't publicly criticize his students, and he wished they wouldn't do the same to him. The paper of Dimitri's that I have in front of me is called Rationalism, Critical and Pancritical. What did Popper and Bartley disagree about? That title may have slightly changed if you look for it online, because I believe the copy I have is a pre-publication that Dimitri sent to me, a working paper. So it may have slightly changed, but I'm sure it's pretty much the same. And Dimitri starts with that question and that problem of Popper not responding to Bartley in print. The important piece of new evidence here that Dimitri wants to bring to bear, at least one of them, is from a conference in Kyoto, where Popper makes clear that he doesn't think Bartley's philosophy changed his at all. Now, Bartley thinks it did, of course. He thinks that it was an improvement. And when Popper goes back, and we're going to talk a little bit about some of the changes Popper makes to his early works in light of Bartley's theory, Popper is going to go on to say here that they aren't really changes at all, or they're simply aesthetic. There's no real change to the substance. And where Dimitri comes out on this is to look at the characters of the two men and the social interaction between them, and to put most of the disagreement down to their personalities, and simply a failure to understand each other's position. Something irreducible to Bartley misunderstanding Karl Popper's critical rationalism, Popper not properly understanding Bartley's criticism of critical rationalism, a certain ambiguity within Bartley's work, and a deep-seated tension that grew and became its own life force. Dimitri starts by saying that what Bartley was doing was to open up the rationalist attitude and to keep us all as open-minded as possible, as open to argument as possible, and as ready to revise those arguments again as possible. And he thought that Popper agreed with this, or at least he agreed with it in writing. The trouble is, it was most clearly expressed by Bartley and not Popper, this particular part. But Popper believed it was there within his philosophy the entire time. Dimitri has a quote from Bartley here that he manages to drag up from 1984, and this is very close to when Bartley actually died, where he talks about how he sat down to discuss the core of the book that he went on to write in 1960 with Karl Popper. And from there on out, Popper went back to the Open Society and its enemies, particularly chapter 24. And this is the fourth and subsequent editions from that, and altered them. And Bartley says he altered them to mute his Fideism and to remove any hint of relativism. And these changes were not Popper's doing. It was Bartley pushing them upon him, showing the error within his own work. Now, Bartley goes on to say in a similar time that some of these things might have been relatively unimportant. The core may have existed there anyway. But he is not going to step back from the point of saying that there is justificationism creeping into Popper's philosophy, or that it had crept in, and that Popper couldn't see it. And some of this may have been a challenge of terminology. Before critical rationalism, rationalism was called, or tended to be called, comprehensive rationalism, or perhaps uncritical rationalism. And this was opposed, of course, to Popper's own critical rationalism. Now, when Bartley comes out with his first formulation of pancritical rationalism, He calls it comprehensive critical rationalism. And Dimitri thinks that the wording does trip Popper up a little bit here. Because he has embodied this terminology so heavily, he can't properly understand what Bartley is doing differently and the different ways in which Bartley is using it. Essentially, this points down to what Dimitri calls a verbalist distinction. The problem is a problem of language and a problem about the way the two men speak to each other. But, and Dimitri says this, it is undeniable the language Popper uses before Bartley came ahead and changed it did quite obviously, and this is Dimitri's quote, smack of Fideism and irrationalism. Dimitri prints out for us the 1950 edition and the 1962 edition of the Open Society and highlights the sections that were changed. I won't run through all the details here, but a change from the original one was whenever one adopts a rational attitude, he does so because he's adopted, without reasoning, some proposal or decision or habit or behavior, which therein must be termed irrational. By 1962, the words without reasoning are taken out and replaced by consciously or unconsciously. I think the meaning there is quite obviously different. And the phrase, which must therefore be termed irrational, is changed to an adoption of which may be called irrational. So was Popper the whole time thinking when he said it is irrational, that it was simply a colloquial way of speaking, and it's simply the way in which the term has been used, but not really irrational? Well, it's hard to say, but Popper goes on to think that he was meaning this. I personally doubt it myself. This is a man who insisted that when Bartley came to work for him, or to work under him, that Bartley changed his writing style. Now, Bartley's a much better writer than Popper is. He was a journalist at Harvard, at least a student journalist, but he wasn't clear enough writing, and Popper goes on endlessly about the need to be clear. If he's saying now that he used language colloquially, and it didn't mean what it meant, or that he meant something else entirely, well, I'm not really sure what to make of that. When the Kyoto speech comes around, which Dimitri has his hands on, Popper is addressing Bartley's criticism and the charge of Popper being a Fideist. And he says, critical rationalism, I'm going to have to paraphrase here, but critical rationalism is an attitude that I recommend to my readers. It's my belief, perhaps I will quote here, it's only my belief that is a good attitude to try out, or perhaps adopt, so Fideism doesn't come into it. Again, the focus on attitude here towards something, whether it actually has hard set out goals or not, but the attitude is the thing that most matters. I think this is Bartley. It sounds like Bartley's own language, Bartley's own change on the strict formalization of critical rationalism. I know Popper doesn't always do it strictly, but it has a much heavier emphasis within Bartley's work. And the fact that Popper now is putting a heavy emphasis upon it, well, I'm sure Bartley would say it's another one of my influences upon Popper, as well as another one that he is refusing to acknowledge. Dimitri also has a copy of an interview that Popper did with Leslie Graves, and this is the same year of the Kyoto speech. This is 1992, where he claims that he never said that moral attitudes, of course, critical rationalism being a moral attitude, or rationalism being a moral attitude, should be held exempt from criticism. So he's agreeing with Bartley, or he's at least saying there was never a disagreement in the beginning. He goes on to say that, and this is perhaps the most challenging part of Popper's philosophy, when he says we must have faith in reason. That's a quote from the original Open Society and its enemies before it was changed. He says when he said this, it wasn't a kind of faith in terms of a religious faith or a Fideistic faith, but simply the term faith as it might be used to describe a belief in something. But again, I'm not sure this makes it much better. Use the word faith, use the word belief. I don't think you escape the Fideism that Bartley thinks is there. We don't need to simply believe anything. We don't need to hold a belief or a faith of any kind. We can just simply hold it all open to criticism. We don't need to trust that critical rationalism is on the right track. So Dimitri goes on to say, with all these kinds of distinctions and these obvious disagreements, and perhaps more the obvious agreements between the two men, how could they have got it so wrong? How could they not have seen each other's point of view? And Dimitri says it simply boils down to a misunderstanding, or at least most of it boils down to a misunderstanding. It's a question of the personal character of the two men. He says Bartley perhaps is to blame for thinking too highly of his own theory and searching so doggedly for a theory that would supersede Popper's. But it also comes down to Popper's indifference to matters out there in the real world, such as the religious question that Bartley focuses on, as well as some of the obvious problems that existed with the demarcation problem. It was, of course, when Bartley was presenting his challenge to the demarcation problem that he called Popper the Fideist, and it was such an irreparable gap that formed between the two men. Popper goes on to say that this is William Bartley, stressed things that he didn't think were that important. Some of these things would be how irrationalists actually think, and the central place, or at least the central way we have to tackle the tu quoque argument, the U2 argument. Bartley, of course, says the argument is false and it's not valid, but we have to argue it anyway. We have to face it because it's been used by the irrationalists, and there's no reason why we can't argue them out of that position. I think Bartley better understood what irrationalists looked like in the real world. And to Popper, Bartley's fascination with them and some of the allowances he gave to them, perhaps credit would be a better word, he took them seriously, seemed unusual to Popper. Anyway, Bartley presents his ideas. He's expecting a Popperian response from the man who always said we must open our ideas up to criticism, and he doesn't get it. And it all explodes in 1965 at the International Colloquium in the Philosophy of Sciences in London, where Bartley quite excitedly puts forward a theory of his, an important one. And I think he begins to see in that moment, as Dimitri shows, the man before him, Popper, perhaps wasn't the ideal character of philosophy, the ideal character of his own philosophy that people often wanted him to be. And this particular part of the story ends a little bit tragically, with Bartley going on to write the revised edition to The Retreat to Commitment. And when he does so, concealing from Popper some of the heavy changes he made to it that were most critical of Popper. In fact, they had reformed their friendship at this point, to 12 years of absence. And I think Dimitri is right when he says, why did Bartley do this? Why, when he is republishing the book and they're speaking, he says there's nothing really here that's changed, just a single footnote that he pushes Popper towards. Popper reads the footnote and nothing else. So why? I think it's obvious, and Dimitri thinks so too, that it was a simple disagreement over a single principle, a single aspect of philosophy that caused the irreparable rift with Karl Popper earlier on. And Bartley didn't want it to happen again. Popper simply wasn't the pancritical rationalist that Bartley hoped he would be. And I think in many people's minds, he simply wasn't as open to criticism as he should have been. Okay, on to David Miller now. And the criticism I have in front of me is called Comprehensive Critical Rationalism and Assessment, and it's from his book, Critical Rationalism, a Restatement and a Defense. I think I finally said that correctly for the first time in this whole series. I did mention Miller earlier in the way in which Miller defends Bartley, at least one of the ways in which Miller defends Bartley, and the idea that though positions are always criticizable and should be, statements or derivations of those positions need not be, and are not necessarily the case. In fact, often you get a tremendous amount of tautologies and dogmas and trivialities that fall out of our best theories. The fact that they exist, those dogmas and trivialities and tautologies, does not mean the original position should fall apart because those particular statements are uncriticizable. I won't get back into that here, but Miller, after that, goes on to say that he has some problems with pancritical rationalism. And though it's just a chapter in his book and it's not that long, Miller squeezes so much into each paragraph that it's going to be hard to speak about it in too much detail here. But he begins by saying that pancritical rationalism is essentially a methodological doctrine. And because this is the case, any criticism of it needs to be presented methodologically. This is a minor defense of Bartley in some ways, but he goes on to say that Bartley's focus on criticism may simply be a little over the top, that the criticizability is trivially universal, that you have a hypothesis, it's either criticizable or it's not. If there is a potential criticism of it, then great, we have a criticism. If there isn't a potential criticism of it, then that is in itself a criticism of it, that it doesn't have a criticism. So either way, you get a criticism. So the hyper-focus on criticism at all stages and in all places, well, it's not necessary, and it was always there regardless, no matter what you thought of it or which particular theory of rationality you embraced. When things become real in the world is when we begin to talk about what standard of criticism we need to actually use, and when and where we should apply it. But of course, Bartley is focused on the larger picture, the eco-niche. And Miller says there's really no great harm if we want to expand this domain of criticizability beyond perhaps Karl Popper's demarcation. And we can do so quite trivially. Simply all statements are criticizable. But, he says, Bartley wants more. That the truth of any statement needs to be something that we can investigate, and critically investigate. Without this, he says, there is no pancritical rationalism. But Miller is saying that criticizability is not some automatic property of all statements that naturally exists. It's something we give to them and we supply to them. And in where we don't find them, well, we're already offering criticism, a de facto kind of criticism. So what exactly is Bartley saying, Miller says? Miller then gets into that criticism that John Watson and John Post brought, the alleged paradoxes within the logic of pancritical rationalism. And he defends Bartley here, though does so in a certain backhanded way. When Post and Watkins brought forward their paradoxes, a challenge that Bartley responds with is that he put forward pancritical rationalism using natural language, not using strict formalization. And this, Miller says, is a pretty weak response. Post and Watson found paradoxes. And he says the thing you ought to do in this case is to formalize your position. You can't simply fall back onto Tarski and say semantic paradoxes always exist within language, and I'm going to insist upon using language, when your opponents are saying we've found criticisms within logic and formal logic. Miller says, and this is a quote, "I don't think that this response will do. If for no other reason, then he gives no actual real hint of how this paradox or these paradoxes will be resolved. Just that there's a possibility that they might be. And for Miller, this isn't good enough. It is Miller's own position that Post's argument is invalid. But he thinks so is Bartley's response. He thinks that Post and Watkins and Bartley have misunderstood what a position is and what a statement is. And if they understood this, it in fact would resolve that paradox. And it would be the response that Bartley should have given. What Miller wants to say is that if you want to be a rationalist, perhaps it's better thought of like this, that any statement that you accept must be either criticizable on itself or by itself, or must follow from another statement that you accept as being criticizable. This means that second step, which is what Post put forward, I should open up a little bit here. The first one being 1, or A, every statement is open to criticism, and B, A is open to criticism. Well, we can simply criticize A. We don't need to. We don't need to worry so much that B is uncriticizable, because it is criticizable by A, and we only get B as a derivation of A. There's nothing exceptional about it. Of course, Miller is open to the idea here that people are going to call this kind of movement an ad hoc addendum, the kind of thing you're not allowed to do in logic and in science and philosophy, a way of simply avoiding criticism. But Miller is going to say that all you need to do is look at the history of the philosophy of science and the history of science itself and of all knowledge. And at all steps, unfalsifiability rides into the picture on the back of falsifiable statements. If you insist that those things that ride in must also be criticizable and falsifiable, well, then you walk back into those paradoxes, those tautologies, those dogmas, and a vacuous landscape where you can't make any progress. He says that we should be grateful to Watkins and Post because what they brought forward was certainly interesting. It just simply wasn't the damaging criticism of pancritical rationalism that they believed it was. Now, a small note on what Bartley ended his book with and mentioned a few times within it, which is the uncriticizability of logic itself. And that is that pancritical rationalists had a certain type of challenge put towards them that went like this. You are still committed to something. You do still make an irrational commitment to something. That irrational commitment is towards logic itself. Now, Miller thinks this isn't quite true. He says, and this is a quote, "This bemuses me. This idea that the pancritical rationalists assume that logic is beyond criticism, or at least the principle of logic is beyond criticism." He says logic only ever enters critical discussions in certain formulations, which is when something needs to be correct or incorrect, perhaps. Now, he does speak about Bartley, and he says Bartley looks at the issue in a slightly different way. He says that the real question is whether we can ever revise logic in the sense of denying it and denying that true premises lead to true conclusions. And he says that to be a rationalist, you must deny that this is possible, that this could be challenged and criticized. But Miller isn't quite buying this, and he has a quote. He says, "Does anyone imagine that materials science is invincible because one must use material science to defeat material science?" So it's not necessarily true that logic is invincible because you must use logic to defeat logic. He says that Bartley hasn't properly understood the logic of that particular argument. The rules of logic, after all, are universal. And if they were to lead to the kind of error that Bartley says we would face if we were to open it up to criticism, well, we simply might face that error and say we've gone wrong in some way, and that we got those rules of logic wrong. I'm not sure if Bartley would have disagreed so much with Miller here. I believe Bartley is open, and he said so, to logic changing, it being revisable. But there's a principle of logic underlying it all, the idea that you need rational argument to have rational argument. But again, Miller would say not necessarily. He would say rational argument is not invincible simply because you need rational argument to defeat rational argument. Now, Miller does go on and give more detail here, but I don't want to get bogged down in the logic of it. But I think perhaps we need to end Miller on some of the thoughts Miller has about Bartley's criticism of Popper, and particularly the attitude of Popper. He says, Bartley looks at Karl Popper. He says Popper has this unfortunate tendency to demand convention or an irrational decision whenever some point is reached which you can't justify by any other means. And this is that fighter's leap towards a commitment or irrational commitment in faith. Miller, and he's going to pre-echo the next critic of Bartley here, says there's no question of that leap actually being irrational. He says all we're really trying to do is the task of separate truth from falsehood. And there's no real danger by doing that. That the decisions we make, if we do follow truth and falsehood, and that's the guided principle, that anything we accept or reject is never really going to be arbitrary. It's always going to be constrained by that desire to achieve truth and to reject falsehood. He says in the final few paragraphs here that for all Bartley's interest in truth, he missed this. And for all his disdain of justificationism, he seems to have, and perhaps this is a quote here, he seems to have lost his nerve at the last minute. Okay, on to Joseph Agassiz, who of course knew both men, Karl Popper and William Bartley, quite well. In fact, he tried to mediate often the long-running dispute that they have, sending letters or communicating between the two, trying to bridge that gap. The paper of Agassiz I have in front of me is called Critical Rationalism, Comprehensive or Qualified, the Popper-Bartley Dispute, and it's online, and it's online courtesy of Agassiz himself. I ought to say from the outset, I did 2 interviews with Joseph Agassiz, not about Bartley, and he writes like he speaks. He doesn't give enough detail often. You're begging for him to give you a little more, and he's very brief and very short, and his mind shoots around between ideas. And often on the pages of an article like this, you really want him to sit down and lay out some clear ideas, or clearer ideas, on what he really thinks about things. But he's going to do so in only his particular tones. So we're always going to be left, no matter what article you read of Agassiz, you tend to be left a little confused and always wanting a little more. But he begins this particular one by saying that the whole paper is an effort to neutralize, that's his word, neutralize the dispute between Bartley and Popper. He then goes into a long history of rationalism itself, and it's only about 10-15 pages long, that particular part, but it is a very interesting way to understand the history of rationalism. And I've noticed over the years, I've read this quite a few years back now, it's the one that stuck in my own head. He looks at the move that Bartley made from Popper's philosophy, because of course Bartley was a critical rationalist before he was a pan-critical rationalist. And he's saying there's no need to make 2 moves when one will do. We don't need to reduce the standard of rationality to make it rational. We don't need to give concessions. But Popper considered that his very reduction to a minimum standard of rationality was already the concession he was given, and that was it. Popper didn't see the point. That's not quite right. Popper failed to understand the point that Bartley was making. When Bartley goes on to say that even the commitment to rationalism is something that is open to critical debate, Agassiz says Bartley is obviously right. And he says it's a tremendous pity that Popper didn't simply admit this, or at least admit it as a possibility. Instead, he goes back, and this is Agassiz's reading of the debate, he goes back and suggests that Bartley had merely improved his wording of something that was already there, rather than change the underlying understanding. He says it's also a pity that Bartley conflated his particular theory with a otherwise possible valid criticism of Popper, that is, being too attached to his own formalization of pancritical rationalism, or the language he uses to describe it, and not been happy simply with a criticism of Karl Popper. He says this presents an error on both sides, and there you have your impasse, and this is why, and how it leads up to, Bartley calling Popper a fideist, and the 2 men never speaking. He says that classical rationalism should clearly be proven by its own light. That if you're going to put forward some authority where all knowledge comes from, or some way of justifying or verifying something, then we need to at least prove it by the light of that same theory. Because of course you're claiming that all rationality flows from this one thing, or all truth does. Well, let truth flow. But Agassiz says he's not so sure that critical rationalism should be proven by its own light, which is what, of course, Bartley wants to do, or insists upon. And Agassiz is not so sure that by not applying it to its own light, that you're actually limiting it in any way. He says, is it even possible to discuss this thing without begging the question? He offers Popper a way out of this that I think most critics of critical rationalism would hate. He says that Popper opens or presents a solution to the problem of rationality. He says he's not presenting a logical truth. What he's presenting is a conjecture, a novel theory that allows us to achieve the growth of knowledge. How does Popper know, for example, that criticism is enough and that the level of criticism that he supplies is enough? Well, Bartley says he doesn't, and that's simply his conjecture. This is, I'm sure there's more to it here, but this is weasel words, this particular part. This is how a critical rationalist runs away from argument, I believe. I've heard this kind of thing before. When valid and interesting criticism comes against you, you simply say, well, it's conjecture. Well, by saying that, you're saying nothing. But Agassiz does believe that Popper is leaving open the question or opening up the place of criticism to criticism. And he seems to think that critical rationalism does offer this. He says, does it apply to Popper's own theory? Should a critical rationalist be open-minded about being open-minded? Well, Agassiz's response is, and this is a quote, "This is hard to say." Again, this is often what he does. He puts forth really interesting conundrums like that and leaves us with a very short and terse response, which doesn't give us what we really want. But he goes on to say that in this discussion, he dissents from both Popper and Bartley. He thinks they're both wrong. Critical rationalism and pancritical rationalism has its mistakes. We don't have time to get into that, and in this particular article, it's simply not explained, or certainly not in enough detail. But he does say that Bartley's comprehensive critical rationalism, his pancritical rationalism, is a commitment to critical assessment of all kinds and in all places. But then he says the same is true for Popper. And he says the same for Popper, and a quote, "Of course." But there's one obvious area where Popper doesn't seem to actually allow this, or doesn't open it up to. Agassiz says from here he can't see how the two disagree. But I think it's obvious how they disagree. He then gets into a discussion about just how rigorous that criticism should be. And he has a kind of hypothetical discussion between Bartley and Popper, where Popper is saying that the rational enterprise is open to criticism. And Bartley's saying, well, just how much is open to criticism? How great a risk is it the whole enterprise have fallen down? Are you really open to this? And Popper asks him back, how much do you need before it's enough? Well, Bartley would say all of it. What would Popper say in Agassiz's mind? He doesn't tell us, certainly not in any specificity. What Agassiz does do here is give Bartley credit for understanding something that Popper didn't understand, which is the rationalists. Now, I keep saying that Popper didn't understand them, but of course he did. His background is full of the most violent kind of irrationalists, and that's why he wrote a lot of the books he wrote. But I thought, or at least I think from reading Bartley, there's a way in which he actually misunderstands them, as he doesn't take serious their claims. He calls them pseudoscience, of course, and he segments them away into a bundle and says they are beyond criticism. Now, I think what Agassiz and Bartley both know that Popper doesn't here is that this is not going to satisfy them. You can explain why their position is uncriticizable. You can explain why it is pseudoscience as opposed to science. But this is not going to get you anywhere with them. They're already rationalists. What you need to do is criticize their theory, even if you believe it is uncriticizable or no criticism will ever achieve what you want. Criticism is still always possible. So why is the Bartley-Popper debate important for Agassiz? Why did he put pen to paper and write about his two former colleagues, and one of them his former teacher? It's because Bartley takes seriously those arguments, those tu quoque arguments, and the kinds of sleight-of-hand maneuvers that the irrationalists use. And Bartley is keen not simply to push them to the side, as perhaps would be tempted, but to offer a way to begin to show that you are distinctly different from them, that the rationalist and the irrationalist have nothing in common. Agassiz goes on to talk about the social framing of the argument between the two men, and he explains in more detail how critical rationalism and pancritical rationalism are both tremendous improvements upon the comprehensive rationalism and the traditional rationalism that came before it. But he still says over and over again things like this. This is a quote. What Popper means is clear enough. Both democracy and science are open to reform. What this means for Bartley above and beyond what it means for Popper, I cannot see. He says the discussion, and it's another quote, the discussion becomes too abstract. Now that's not the feeling I got. I certainly got the feeling when you get bogged down in some of those appendices of Bartley's, that the discussion becomes abstract. But the heart of the book, The Retreat to Commitment, is not abstract at all. I think there's an obvious distinction there, an obvious whole, and Bartley's onto it. Now it may be true, I'll give the credit here to Agassiz, that perhaps Bartley had a valid criticism, but he presented it through his own theory that what he wanted to use as a replacement for Popper's, and that's where some of the distinction happens. But I think the criticism is certainly valid. He says, this is Agassiz, that of course it was a mistake to call Popper a fideist, not simply because Popper's character, but because Popper wasn't a fideist. He says there is no link, no matter how tenuous, between a critical rationalist and a fideist. I'm not sure how Bartley would respond to this, but he would say that there are fideist elements within critical rationalism if they follow those original formalizations that Popper did, particularly within the Open Society and its enemies, before Bartley came along and offered him a means to correct them. And Agassiz ends it here, on this note. He says, I know Popper and Bartley agreed that they disagreed. I don't know on what. And that's from Joseph Agassiz. That's from one of the leading critical rationalists that has ever existed. That's from a man who knew Popper better than most and Bartley better than most, and certainly understood their philosophies better than most. So what that says actually about the dispute, I'm not quite sure, but it's certainly an interesting point to leave Agassiz on and to move on to Ian Jarvie. Now, Ian Jarvie was a contemporary of Bartley, and again, a student of Popper's. And just like David Miller, he sadly died about a year or so ago. And this particular offering I will leave perhaps briefer than the ones before it, because Jarvie doesn't go into huge detail here. He does go into detail about the parts of Bartley's philosophy that he likes. And the paper before me is called Philosophy and Its Problems by Ian Jarvie, and it's written in as part of a volume which was dedicated to the life of Bartley, posthumously of course. And it begins with this statement. It says, W. Bartley III, whose ideas influenced me more than those of any other contemporary. From that you can see where Jarvie is going with this. Jarvie, as a critical rationalist, pushed critical rationalism into the social sciences. And he says that Bartley's philosophy opened up that space for him. He says from Bartley we get a way of throwing our presuppositions, all of our presuppositions, into criticism, into question, and which allows us to work and practice in a much more open way, in an infinite way. We get to be more critical of where we are now, as well as our past efforts to do so. That's our past efforts to philosophize and create theories. Jarvie admires Bartley for his treatment of the Western and Eastern philosophy and the distinction between them, particularly that non-dual influence within Eastern philosophy, and how, though it has its limitations and its problems, also offers a lot, at least a step out of some of the convictions of Western philosophy. He says that after Bartley it was possible to put forward a much more fruitful philosophy, a way to offer students a fresh look upon the world, one that helped us overcome the traditions of philosophy that had us mired within certain problems that were merely verbal or definitional, certain problems that were non-essential. He allows us a new respect for the philosophical endeavor itself and the full range of it, a full range of what constitutes a theory and what constitutes criticism. Jarvie says that what he's done for a lot of his philosophy is follow the directives or the path laid out by Bartley. That is to discover problems and seek as severe criticism as possible, and to follow that severe criticism wherever it may lead, without presupposing anything and without holding any path as a boundary. He says that focus on problems was much better focused upon in Bartley's philosophy, that the central place of the problem within philosophy, within all philosophy, was an emphasis of Bartley's. Now, I didn't get this myself from reading Bartley, but of course I'm not as well read on Popper or Bartley as Jarvie as Jarvie was. He said, as students, Bartley and himself, Jarvie, were both trained by Popper to develop what he called a nose for problems, and a way to distinguish between genuine ones and pseudo ones, interesting ones and trivial ones. But he says, and this part seems certainly true, that Bartley understood, at least he went on to embody this in a better way, that genuine philosophical problems are always those that are rooted outside of philosophy itself, in the real world, so to speak. And I think this is why Bartley, at least an example of why Bartley focuses on those irrationalists so well, why he understands those religious reformers that he was trying to push back upon, why he's so focused on the history of such a reform movement, and in certain times and places how it came so close to being genuinely rational, and how it could slip into irrationality so quickly, and some of the traps that existed. It wasn't an abstract discussion for Bartley. He was looking at the real world and how the real world behaved. And those were the problems he was trying to solve, not a laboratory discussion between what is good science and bad science. Now, what Jarvie and Bartley and Agassiz as well focus on, and this is to the detriment of Popper because he didn't, was metaphysics. All three believe that there's a much more central role within science for metaphysics. And though it is not strictly science, it is still absolutely central to science and incredibly criticizable. And perhaps more importantly, something that we never have to sit beyond the goal that we're looking at, which is as rationalists looking at the world. We never have to accept that our metaphysical premises are something that we get to defend irrationally. It's an unpleasant place to put ourselves, and we don't need to be there. In some places here, Jarvie says what is good in Popper is better in Bartley. That whereas Popper offered us a way to have a non-authoritarian philosophy, a non-authoritarian epistemology, Bartley offers it a little bit better. Whereas Popper steps away from justificationism, Bartley does it more completely, and so on. All those improvements on freeing up the world of epistemology are just a little better in Bartley, Jarvie believes. There are certain things that Bartley said within his work that have stuck with Jarvie throughout his life. One of them was when Bartley said that he had discovered that he believes, is a better way of saying it, that there were three principles of philosophy, three problems that existed at the heart of all things. That is the problem of knowledge, the problem of rationality, and the problem of reconciling rationality and knowledge. That simple formulation, Jarvie goes on to say, allowed him to see the world and his own work in much clearer lights. He says that he agrees with Bartley at a certain point here. He came around to it slowly, but he agrees with him that all philosophical problems are directly related to those three, and that we need to be asking ourselves at all steps when we work within the bounds of epistemology and rationality, which is things like, does our solution to the problem of knowledge make rationality impossible? Does our solution to the problem of rationality make knowledge impossible? And these kinds of checks are ways of keeping us open to possibilities out there in the world, and the mistakes that we're making and the doors we're opening to the irrationalists. And perhaps I should leave it on this point here of Jarvie saying that that kind of check and that kind of import had him going through his entire career with a kind of Bartleyan quote knocking around the back of his mind, which is, everything is criticizable. Everything. And so instead of thinking, as some of the previous critics have, that there was either no debate here, or that there was a debate and Bartley was wrong about some things, or he overreached, or he made tremendous mistakes by thinking there's a difference between critical rationalism and pancritical rationalism, Jarvie says that the development of pancritical rationalism through the Retreat to Commitment and some of his later works was the most important epistemological work that ever happened in Jarvie's lifetime, and he thinks has changed and will continue to change the landscape of epistemology into the future.